Enumerator Resources for the 1990 U.S. Census. This is another one of my census talks on JDW Talks. My target audience are going to be census researchers, future users of the 1990 census in 2062, that's when it's going to become public, users of 1990 census data and census information in general. So I have a lot of topics here. The emphasis is going to be on the 1990 enumerators. And of course, anytime you can pause this video to read some of the detailed slides I am going to show. But here are a list of topics. A lot to cover. Let's start off by references. And the main one is going to be this procedural history of the 1990 census. I'm going to put in the show notes the actual addresses, internet addresses for all of this material. But this is a major one. It answers a lot of questions about the 1990 U.S. Census. In addition to that, I found online an interesting pamphlet which shows examples of 1990 the census questionnaires, and a lot of other forms. I'll talk about that later. There are two websites that have an overview of the instructions to respondents that the enumerators gave. And there's the first one from IPUMS. It's a Minnesota group. And then one from the U.S. Census Bureau. The U.S. Census Bureau also has a website showing here that gives you all of the official publications so that you can find them relatively easily. I also had, and I got this online at an auction site, a guide to the census publications. Very, very thick document, lots of material there. Now, just so that you're not worried about it says not to go out of the library. It turns out that this was withdrawn, so it's perfectly legal, I guess, to acquire it. It wasn't stolen. In addition to that, as you can see, I somehow acquired three kits, enumerated kits, for the U.S. Census. It has lots and lots of different information. Here's what's in one of those kits. You can see the enumerator badge there. I think one of the kits actually is from a supervisor. The kits had lots and lots of manuals. This was an interesting one, a self-study for enumerators. And what I've done is that, since I could not find this online, is that I OCR'd it, and I have put it on my Dropbox account. So you can get your own copy of this by going to that particular address. Self-study for enumerators. There was a manual for enumerators manual on field follow-up TAR areas. Lots of abbreviations for the 1990 census. And TAR is, and I quote from this, the procedural history, that the Bureau purchased computerized residential mailing lists for a number of predominantly urban mail delivery areas. These were called Tape Address Register, or TAR areas, which covered about 55-56% of the nation's housing units. So most of the manuals were TAR areas. There was an enumerators workbook. There was a closeout procedures for enumerators, a last chance to try and get information. And then there was this interesting separate instructions, non-response follow-up enumeration instructions, very detailed. And you can see there are lots of appendices here, and it's a really detailed look at the enumerator responsibilities. There was a manual on payroll and administrative matters that were in 2 of the kits that I saw, and it included how to fill out payroll requests, also about safety and accidents. And then I found online that Google Books has some of these manuals that I didn't have. This was online. It's a guide for training crew leaders, and another one training enumerators. But this is not the TAR areas. This is a pre-list, which is mostly rural areas. So let's look at the basics for the 21st Federal Census. So this is 200 years after the 1790 census, the 1990 census. The federal census is mandated by the U.S. Constitution every 10 years since 1790. This is the 21st decennial census. The questions may differ between the years, and there's a 72-year privacy period, so that the 1990 census should become public on April 1st, 2062. The privacy period has nothing to do with life expectancy, and I have a whole YouTube video on this subject. Why the 1990 census? Well, that SelfStudy manual for enumerators reports a number of situations. Primarily, it reapportions seats in the House of Representatives, and I'm going to give you a quiz on this. In fact, there's a quiz in that self-study book. More than 50 federal laws require the use of census data to allocate funds, so this is an important aspect. States and local governments plan using the 1990 census for placement of transportation systems, various facilities, schools, police, fire, health, etc. Businesses use the census to figure out whether they can get a workforce in an area, site location, etc. And then there are all sorts of organizations, churches, private schools, daycare centers, nursing homes that want to know not only where the populations are, but something about the age groups that you're dealing with. And then there's a lot of academics and research and economics that use census material. So some 1990 census facts. The Census Bureau has a web page on an overview of various censuses, and there's an overview of the 1990 census there. So the 1990 census counted and obtained characteristics for close to 249 million people and over 100,000 housing units in the U.S. And you can see that some of the other aspects of the United States, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, American Samoa, etc., that shows their population structures as well. Get some water. And then by special agreement, Paloa also was enumerated. There was a short form that asked 13 questions on the questionnaire and a long form that asked 45 questions. Talk about these. A long form census questionnaire is sent to a statistically selected sample of housing units. And in simple terms, that means the information collected from long form households will apply to the entire U.S., not just the housing units that receive the long form. That's the theory behind sampling. By using a sample, the Census Bureau makes completing the census questionnaire a very easy job for about 80%, might even be 85% actually, of the American public, those who get the short form. And from the procedural history, a little bit more detailed about that the 1990 sampling scheme was an extension of the one used in 1980. Areas of the country containing over half of the households and housing units were sampled on a 1 in 6 basis. Probably those are urban areas. In large census tracts and block numbering areas, generally those with more than 2,000 housing units, the sample rate was 1 in 8. And for governmental units containing fewer than 2,500 people, the rate was 1 in 2. So the overall sampling rates for 1990 included about 15% of the population and 16% of the housing units. Now, one thing that is important is how many people were missed on the census. And that's called the undercount. And the 1990 census had an estimated net undercount of 1.8%. So about 1 out of 50 people were missed. But it's appreciably larger undercount for African Americans. And so there are voting rights and apportioning of Congress that are impacted by this. So in June of 1991, a Census Bureau group recommended using an adjusted population count. But in July 1991, the Secretary of Commerce decided that the 1990 census would still use the unadjusted totals. There were a lot of lawsuits. The issue went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, which sided with the Secretary of Commerce. And this was a major debate area for this census. So this census involved a mail-out, mail-back strategy, but not for everybody. So this is from the procedural history that indicates that for 1990, the U.S. Postal Service system, again, was the preferred method of taking the census, where there were house numbers, street name, addresses in the 50 states and District of Columbia. Elsewhere in sparsely settled parts of the country, or in Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, Pacific Island territories, enumerators had the primary role. So there are 3 basic ways of taking the census. The mail-out, mail-back, and Census Bureau loves abbreviations. Bureau mailed pre-addressed short or long form questionnaires to about 86 million housing units, asking the occupants to complete the forms and mail them back. Then there was the update leave. Enumerators visited 10.3 million housing units, verified the addresses, and left questionnaires for the nearly 25 million occupants to complete and mail back to a census district office. And then the third one, which was a list enumerate, that letter carriers delivered advanced census reports. I'm going to show you that. Unaddressed short-form household questionnaires to people who received the mail at post offices or on rural routes. Enumerators visited the housing units in the states, listed them in their address registers, collected those ACRs, and asked additional questions where the units were designed to receive the sample long form. So in previous censuses, this was called the conventional or door-to-door method. In a sense, I'm doing this in 2022, and looking back, the 1950 census was really door-to-door. There wasn't this mail out and then pick up, so it's not quite what we would consider the door-to-door method. So this is an ACR, an Advanced Census Report, residential customer local. You can see it's one of these fill in the blanks, except the person were to list the names of the people in the household. And then it says to the person, the respondent, please make sure you filled this form completely. And then it goes down here, print the name of the household member who filled the form. And then specifically it says, do not mail this form. A census taker will visit your household to pick up the form. That's what they did. Now my emphasis here, although some of the enumerated kits I have contain these blank advanced census reports, implying that they were, involved in partially some rural areas, my main emphasis in this video is on enumerators doing follow-ups from mail-out, mail-back areas, mostly urban areas, dense urban areas. So the questions, I'm not going to go through the questions per se. The procedural history has a very nice table here, as you can see, It compares the 1990 to 1980 questions, and also the 100% is everybody gets to answer those questions in the short form, and then the S are samples. They actually answer the first part and additional sample questions. And some of the questions are really interesting. Travel time to work, week's work last year. I'm looking at some of these things here. Mobility and self-care limitations. Lots of interesting stuff here. Very detailed. There was lots of publicity for the 1990 census. In fact, in the upper right is a pin that I have that was given out, and now you can buy these as collectibles. And according to this particular website, the Americans were alerted to the importance of responding to the 1990 census by extensive public television, radio, and print advertising. Promotion activities included local complete count committees, information kits and lesson plans for schools. I looked for that, couldn't find it. Churches, local government outreach partnerships, free public service announcements, etc. Some of them are kind of interesting. The Census Bureau has this website showing an example of promotional pins, both in English and probably a language that was predominant in this particular county. There were a number of forms that were used for the 1990 census. I pointed out earlier that you can find online this pamphlet that shows you examples of these forms. And, dozens and dozens and dozens of forms, all with specific numbers. So if you're an enumerator, one of the things you would have with you are these a booklet of these confidential forms. We know we can count on you. When you approach somebody to try and get an interview, you would give this person the form. And the forms were in English, and they were in Spanish. Another one, your answers are confidential. English and in Spanish. And then some more intense forms that were given out. Help yourself and your community, especially probably for people who are reluctant to do the interview. A little bit of the history of the U.S. Census and what it was used for. And then a guide to actually filling out the questionnaire. Now, one of the problems with a Mailout Mailback is that there were lots of non-response. People did not follow through. And it created a problem because it was underestimated by the Census Bureau. So the mail return rate, a measure of public cooperation, represented the number of mail returns from occupied units only. Here the Bureau expected a 78% return rate for 1990, and that's what they based their workforce on that. Approximately 5% points lower than 1980. However, the return rates were lower than that. They were lower than that. And because of that, they were in a real bind, as I'll tell you later, about getting qualified enumerators. They spread them thinner than they wanted to, and they spent a longer time in the field than they anticipated. Actually had to request an additional funding from Congress. So the reasons for non-response, or possible reasons why people may not return the questionnaire, are that the questionnaire was hard to read or hard to fill out. The occupants had difficulty with the English language. The questionnaire was misplaced, lost, or never received. The occupant was traveling on census day, or people feel that they are too busy or that the census isn't important. So this non-response follow-up, this NRFU, everything is abbreviated, was the largest data collection activity during the 1990 census. Approximately 200,000 temporary employees worked on these non-response follow-ups, which enumerated more than 34 million housing units. At about 3% of the housing, the occupied units, the enumerators ended up with just last resort information, which means that they didn't get full, participation of the people that were there. At least 3 out of 4 population items, that's last resort, were gotten, and 2 housing items, if repeated telephone and personal visit contacts were not successful. At vacant units, are they really vacant or not, last resort information could be limited to the building description. These follow-up work was subject to quality assurance checks for completeness. It is interesting. And these included choosing an administrative sample of about 350,000 cases to be re-interviewed, mainly to check for possible data falsification. Approximately 2,600 cases of fraud were found. I'll talk about that later. So the Census Bureau sent out this, what did you do with your form, people? And this may have been sent out in, general. And it said, did you mail back your 1990 census questionnaire? There's still time. Remember, your answers are very important. Find your questionnaire, fill it out. Thank you for your cooperation. And the census enumerators got a printout of these no response addresses and had went to these sites. We'll show you more detail what their jobs requirements were, and put down, if they were still not there, sorry I missed you, my name is, I can be reached at, I want to set up an appointment, both in English and in Spanish. So let's look and find out what it would take for you to become an enumerator. What are the requirements? Well, a major recruiting goal for 1990 for the Census Bureau was to have an indigenous workforce, one that was representative of the local labor force with respect to race, ethnicity, and language, with the idea of reducing the undercount to minority groups. Nationally, the census met that goal, with almost 33% of the field force coming from minorities, nearly twice the representation in the 1980 civilian labor force. The Bureau also tried to hire enumerators to work in the areas where they lived. Finding qualified local applicants was not always successful, so strangers had to be brought in on occasion. So if you were applying for a 1990 enumerator position, you would have to take a written test to show abilities to read, follow written instructions, etc. There was an additional test for data transcription. I'm going to show you some sample questions in a second. You had to be physically fit for the job. You had to be able to travel distances by using car or public transportation, climb stairs, read small print, and have the ability to speak and hear normal conversation. There's a lot of turnover of people who didn't realize that they couldn't do it. 3, an applicant generally had to be 18 years old, although persons aged 16 or 17 could be hired if they met conditions of employment set by state or local laws and were either high school graduates or had equivalent education or work experience. There were no education requirements for persons 18 years old and over. They really had a broad net because they were desperate to find enumerators. All applicants were expected to be available to work at least 30 to 40 hours a week. But persons who could work 20 hours were encouraged to apply. You can see the desperation here. Note, all potential applicants were encouraged to apply. Persons were expected to have a satisfactory work record for the past 5 years. Poor job performance, dishonesty, criminal or immoral conduct, etc. could be a basis for non-selection. 6. Conviction of a violation of the law since age 18 for something other than a minor traffic violation could be a basis for non-selection. So, could be a basis. A person could not engage in any political activity, partisan, during any 24-hour period in which the census work was performed. Anyone barred from a civil service exam could not be considered for employment. An applicant for a crew leader or enumerator position could not be also employed as a tax assessor, tax collector, or law enforcement officer. 10. Applicants without a Social Security number were not eligible to be hired. 11. All males born after December 31st, 1959 and age 18 or older had to be registered with a selective service system. Applicants not registered by age 26 could not be hired. All applicants were required to present documentation of employment eligibility. Could be asked to produce police records, driver's licenses, Social Security cards. 13. There was a preference perhaps to people with veteran status. 14. And they were required to take an oath of office. Those who refused to do so were not hired. Now, I have a brochure, a flyer, 3-part, about whether that was in one of the kits. And it was about employment test information for census job applicants. So this is your responsibilities. Enumerators work in the field, in neighborhoods, rural areas, colleges, apartment buildings, etc., gathering census information. There's several kinds of enumerators. I'm not going to emphasize all of them, but most of the jobs involve person-to-person contacts and a lot of walking or driving and climbing stairs. Some enumerators, but not you guys, survey assigned areas in order to develop accurate and complete lists of mailing addresses for use during the census. Others check the results of these activities to make sure that no mailing addresses were omitted which should have been listed. A few quality control enumerators assist in training enumerators, and they correct enumerators' work that is determined to be unsatisfactory. However, this is going to be your task. Many enumerators visit households to collect and/or complete census forms. When household members who are instructed to mail back their completed census forms fail to do so, non-response. Enumerators must visit these households. These enumerators are required to conduct interviews to obtain census information on the household members and on their living quarters. Some of the questions they must ask are what some people consider rather personal. So that's going to be the major TAR people. Still other enumerators gather census information from group living quarters, such as hospitals, nursing homes, etc. They leave questionnaires with the residents of these establishments and conduct personal interviews where necessary. Most enumerator jobs require evening and Saturday work in order to contact persons who are not at home during the day and weekends. And then it continues with some of the requirements. Each applicant is given a written test. This brochure describes the test. None of these questions are actual test questions. And so there's a test with 28 questions. The questions are mostly multiple choice. You got 30 minutes to complete the test. So let's go through the test. Clerical skills. So let's see. And this is, a sample. This is not going to be what's on the actual test. Give you a couple of seconds. In fact, I'll count to myself 10 seconds. Okay, so which number in column A has no match? And the answer is A. So that 82537 has no match in column B. Reading. 10 seconds. Well, maybe a little bit longer. Of course, you could always pause that actually. So as described above, enumerators must. What must they do? And the answer is A, correct the address registers based on their findings in and going across each block. And so you should be able to answer this one. To enumerate means most nearly to, and of course the answer there is when you enumerate, you count. Number skills. Give you a chance for that. Okay, you ready? The answer is B. Interpreting information and evaluating things. Now, this is kind of interesting. So a group of applicants for census jobs was taking a test. Anita did not complete her test until 20 minutes after the rest of the group. Based on the information provided, which of the following is a reasonable statement about Anita's performance? So I think that this is going to test your assumptions, whether you make assumptions that are not there. And the answer they want is they want C. They want somebody who is, doesn't make their own assumptions, are very straight about exactly what is being presented, etc. Kind of an interesting question. So here's one about organizational skills. You can take a look at that. Choose the number that does not follow the pattern. And the answer is C. So the Enumerator Training, and here we have this Enumerator's Manual, and this is what's called a self-study. For the 1990 census, there were more reliance on the use of self-studies, which trainees had to complete prior to their training session. It was presumed that they would derive more out of the classroom session if they understood some of the basics from the start. These self-studies provided operational background and some information about the topic, and then asked some basic questions regarding the presented material. Trainees were allowed to claim from 1 to 2 hours of training time for completing the self-study at home. In other words, they were given money based upon this 1 to 2 hours. And remember, I have OCR'd the Enumerator Manual for you. So this is from the Self-Help Study Guide. And the instructions are, welcome to the 1990 census. A little bit about you're going to be paid for the self-study. Read the paragraphs. They contain information to read and review. And there's going to be a quiz at the end. Complete the review exercise. You must complete the review exercise, that's the exam, and bring the self-study, including the completed review exercise, to the classroom training. Your instructor will collect the review exercise when you report to the training session. If it is not completed, you will not be allowed to participate. Eventually, you'll get that back. After the self-study, the rest of your training will consist of approximately 3 half-days of classroom training. After each half-day, you'll be expected to work in the field for several hours. You will be paid for all time spent in training and doing practice field work. You're given a basic supply: pencils, pen, erasers, pencil sharpener, paper clips. You'll have a crew leader who will be responsible for training you, giving you work, picking up and reviewing your work, obtaining progress reports, helping you with any problems, and making sure you are paid on time. You're going to meet that person every day when you go, on your routes. And your job, and this is an overview here on this self-study, As you probably guessed, not all people in the mailback area complete and return their questionnaires, and some living quarters are vacant. That's where you come in. Your job will be to visit each housing unit for which we do not have a census questionnaire and help the people there complete one, or you must complete one for a vacant housing units. And then it says, well, hey, if people say, hey, I've already mailed back my questionnaire, doesn't matter. You must complete a questionnaire even at those houses, because they may be lying. They may be just putting you off. And then there's a non-response housing units. We call housing units that did not return the census questionnaire non-response housing units. In other words, the basis for this 1990 census is not a, quote, enumeration district. It is not a person. It's a housing unit. Because your job is to follow up on the questionnaires that were mailed to these addresses, your official job title is Non-Response Follow-Up Enumerator. And then it tells you about locating housing units, assignment areas, called an ARA, and how to locate them. You're going to have a printout. You're going to have a map. But if you ever have trouble locating an address, don't be afraid to ask for help. Neighbors, mail carriers, fire stations, and police departments may be able to help you. Long-time residents in apartment buildings, shop owners may also be helpful. And then counting people, you got to figure out who actually lives in this area or not. And you may have some additional forms besides the questionnaire. And then there are a bunch of rules for interviewing. You must follow certain rules. The most important rule is to ask all questions using the wording on the form. Occasionally, people refuse to answer some of the questions on the questionnaire to you. Your best approach in this case is to remain polite and explain why the census question is important and that all answers are kept confidential. If they still refuse to answer, skip the objectionable question and complete as many of the other questions as possible, and then see if they will answer the skipped questions. Occasionally, people may complain that some of the questions on the census questionnaire ask for information that's already provided to other government agencies. This is true, but only the census makes the effort to get all the information from all Americans as of a single date. Furthermore, only the census makes the effort to relate the various items to one another. And then on this self-study, it says never, remember we're talking about fraud here, never, under any circumstances, make up answers to census questions. This is a very serious offense, punishable by a fine and/or imprisonment. If you have problems completing questionnaires, your crew leader will be ready to help you. And this is from the more detailed one about fraud. Your job will not always be easy. There may be some times when your progress is not going well, even though you want to do a good job and keep on schedule. However, you must not submit falsified work to your crew leader under any circumstances. Office personnel and crew leaders are trained to recognize fictitious materials. Additionally, a percentage of all work will be verified for accuracy. Thus, the chances of getting caught are high. If it is discovered that any work you submit have been falsified, you will be dismissed immediately from your job. This action also may have a negative effect on your chances of future federal employment. So this is the review at the end of the self-study. Let's see what you can do with this. You read the question, what's the primary purpose? And the answer is A, and apportion the House of Representatives. The Constitution of the U.S. requires that census be taken. You should know this. B, every 10 years. When the Census Bureau does not have a filled questionnaire for living quarters, that housing unit is called a non-response unit. List 2 uses of the census. We did that earlier in this talk. Okay. 5. Could the Internal Revenue Service see a census questionnaire for a person or family? No. 6. What law guarantees that information provided will be kept confidential? You have to know that. Called Title 13. Individuals can be identified in census publications, can they? Nope, they can't. A census enumerator can be fined or imprisoned for breaking their oath of confidentiality. It's true. What 2 criteria does the Census Bureau use to determine a housing unit? Well, you'd have to read the self-study for that. Live and eat separately from others. Have direct access to the living quarters. First census was taken in, you should know that, 1790. Which of the following is a group quarters? Well, the only one is convalescent homes there. For census work, the 2 types of living quarters are housing units and group quarters. You visit a non-response address and it turns out to be a business, what should you do? Now, this is kind of cute. You might probably get this wrong. Well, look for a housing unit in the same building as the business. So your job, second look, well, you're going to have an official credential. And this is from your Enumerators Manual. This is not the instruction one. So you're a field follow-up enumerator and TAR. You obtain missing or incomplete census information and help ensure that all persons in housing units are enumerated. So you're going to go to vacant and housing that you need to check up on that. There are some failed edit cases. These are people who did return their census forms, their questionnaire, but were missing things. And the Census Bureau couldn't complete it by phone, couldn't reach them, etc. So you're going to go back and fill in the problems, the failed edit. And then there are these non-response cases. They may refuse to participate. You have a checklist of all the things you must carry with you. And of course, every single one of them has a code name. You have your own supplies. Now, I put this in because you can see how many different abbreviations and acronyms that you had to know. Crazy. And then this non-response follow-up enumerator instructions are very, very detailed. You can see here it goes through various steps. Step 1, you got to identify the addresses that you want to that have no response and decide whether you're going to visit them in person or try and do a telephone callback. You got to plan your route. Step 2, make sure you got all your equipment with you. Step 3, before you interview people, you need to complete a section of the form. Step 4 is to actually conduct the interview with a responsible adult. If an adult is not present, you may interview any responsible person who is at least 15 years old. Give the respondent a copy of the Privacy Act notice. Ask every question. If no one is at home, you leave this form asking for an appointment. Step 5, you complete all the information on the questionnaire, and then you go through this. Step 7, you record your daily hours and mileage for payment. You can report daily to your supervisor. And be sure to keep your conversation during interviews brief and to the point. Production rates will remain acceptable and your job will be done most accurately when you eliminate idle conversation. You're going to get a printout, which there was no example of that in my kits. And there's some cute information about the interview. I want to go through that. First of all, and this is from various sources here, you introduce people for the NR no response. Hello, my name is. I'm from the, you can read that. We're taking the 1990 census. Is this, you read the address. If they say yes, I need to complete a questionnaire for this address. It'll take about 7 minutes. 26 minutes for the long form. If they say no, can you tell me where to find, and you read the address. And also for the FE, which are the failed edit cases, you do the same introduction, except now if they say yes, I need to ask a few additional questions, and it'll take about 3 minutes. 13 minutes for the long form. So, this non-response follow-up enumerator instructions have things about how you're dressed, making a good impression, being always cordial and polite. I guess the cartoon on the top is that he is involved in the family eating dinner, and her expression is not an inviting who's there expression. Always try to smile. Be prepared for all types of questions. Give honest answers. Give honest answers. Your introduction is important. You must identify yourself. You represent the Census Bureau. You take census and hand the respondent a Privacy Act notice. And not to make assumptions. So ask the questions using suggested wording. Ask all questions in the order shown. Don't assume any answers. That goes back to that sample question that I showed you earlier. And so here the person looks Hispanic, but I must ask each question, what's your race? And the person says, no, I'm not Hispanic, I'm an Indian. And probe if a person's answer isn't satisfactory. You should probe for more information. You can repeat the question, asking for more information, ask for an estimate, pausing to give the person time to think, zeroing in on the answer so it fits one of the categories on the questionnaire. So the person says, I don't know what my house is worth. And if you don't know, could you give me your best estimate? And it's not clear what the cartoon says. I think my house is worth between, well, if the estimate is between $40,000 and $100,000, that's not very good. Maybe it's $90,000. Never put answers in the person's mouth. In other words, don't suggest answers. It must be worth at least $60,000. And then thank the persons for cooperating. So here are some enumerator working forms. The census questionnaires you will be using, and these are the questionnaires now, are slightly different from the questionnaires that the household received in the Mailout Mailback. The questionnaires you use are called enumerator-friendly questionnaires. Show you what the difference is. So here is a housing question on the Mailout Mailback. Did you leave anyone out of your list of persons? Did you include anyone in your list of persons? Now, if you're an enumerator, your form says, same question. When you told me the names of persons living here on April 1st, did you leave anyone out because you were not sure if the person should be listed, for example? And then the other one, when you told me the names of persons living here, did you include anyone even though they were not sure, you were not sure the person should be listed? And here are the forms that you had to fill out. If you look on the upper top, that's a short form, and that's the long form. You had to fill that out before the interview, and you go through that. You filled out the form with the person in front of you. And then you have a checklist after the interview. If the person was not in the family, didn't live there, you had an individual census report. And here's a questionnaire. Misdelivery record, you had lots and lots of forms. For vacant or deleted areas, you ask, hi, my name is so-and-so, and we're checking addresses in the area to make sure everyone was counted. This interview will take about 2 minutes, and you want to find out about this address, whether it's vacant or not. And you have a form for vacant delete. Here's the deletion form. If no one's at home, that's kind of interesting. I've added this. You can show the extent that the enumerators went to try and find a non-response form. So if no one is home when you first visit the housing unit, you leave an appointment record. You try and obtain from a knowledgeable person the occupant's name, telephone number, and best time to call. If you are only able to obtain a name, check the telephone directory. Attempt to contact the household by telephone 3 times within a 2-day period before visiting again. Try to complete an interview over the telephone. If the person refused to be interviewed by telephone, wait 1 day and visit the housing unit. And then you may have to go through a last resort information. And note that the office has already attempted to telephone failed edit cases. It is not necessary to make telephone callbacks for failed edit cases prior to making personal visit callbacks. Lots of things here. You got a refusal record form. You have it in multiple copies. And then in terms of Enumerator Salary, what you have is very interesting. This is from a Washington Post article that the Census Bureau has had trouble finding enough qualified enumerators in some areas for the 1990 census, creating the possibility that it will have to hire less qualified workers and require staff to cover more territory and stay in the field longer than planned. The poor return rate, coupled with the hiring difficulties, presents what many say is an unprecedented challenge to the Bureau. But the Congressional General Accounting Office has warned that even if the Bureau is able to hire enough enumerators, even if they could hire enough enumerators to begin the street work today, the shortage of applicants could cause significant problems when the first wave of workers begins to quit or get fired. They anticipate that. And this is hard to believe, but in urban areas, the GAO said the Bureau expects 100% turnover, up to 100% turnover among enumerators. While the Bureau had hoped by now to hit 100% of its recruiting goals, finding at least 4 applicants for every position, it has reached only 62% of that goal. The numbers are even lower in some parts of the country, including Florida, California, Silicon Valley, and Manhattan. And so to compensate for that, they increase the pay. So when you're talking about hourly salary rates, it depends on the area and the competition for jobs in that area. And there's a supplemental payment program that was in some of the kits I have, which showed how you can make more money. Tells you about cases, what do you have to do to be eligible, and you could receive as much as $325 extra. Depends on how many cases you completed. And you were given a manual about payroll, and also in that manual was things about safety and accidents. The crew leader had a bunch of accident forms, and you can see that accidents was probably something that was pretty regular. Now, some of the kits, one of the kits in particular, had all sorts of interesting maps involved. Sketches of maps and stuff like that. Notes on them. It's a whole area that I just didn't have enough information on. Fascinating. And then pages of, vacant, etc., to keep track of things. And then they all got a problem that if you're an enumerator, you could call a hotline to discuss unauthorized use, falsifying data of other people. So this has been another of my JDW talks. I have YouTube talks on genealogy topics, census resources, natural history topics, and other things. And to give you an example of some of my previous stuff on censuses, I have a general overview of the census or genealogy perspective from 1790 on. The 1930 census has a YouTube video. The 1940 census has a YouTube video. The 1950 census has many videos, the most recent one. The 1960 census, 1970 census, the 1980 census based upon enumerator kits, and now I'm adding to it the enumerator resources for 1990.